Good afternoon to you all. My name is Habib Kambanga. I'm the head of the Regional Early Warning Center of the Southern African Development Community, SADC, based in Gaborone, Botswana. I will be chairing this session 9, titled Financial Insecurity. Before we proceed, I would like to introduce my panelists. I have 3 panelists. Mr. Benjamin Chidyamoto, who is the Chief Security Officer of the African Development Bank, AfDB. Another panelist is Dr. Mark Wilkinson, the head of Project Department of Peace Operations, DPO, based in Iraq. Also, Ms. Elizabeth Mutunga from the Common Market for the Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA. Allow me to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves, starting with Benjamin, then Mark, then we'll finish with Ms. Elizabeth. Please proceed.
Hi everyone, my name is Benjamin Chidyamoto. I'm with the African Development Bank, as Chair has just said. My organization is the biggest financial institution on the continent, and all African countries are our members. And therefore, we have a responsibility during this crisis to support our member countries in every way possible to get them, to help them get out of this current situation and other developmental projects that they might want financing from the African Development Bank. I thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Mark Wilkinson. I'm the head of projects from UNMAS Iraq. Slightly strange, you might think, UNMAS Iraq represented at a conference really focused on Africa. I'd like to just take this opportunity to give you an oversight of what UNMAS Iraq has done in terms of its response to the COVID crisis, and specifically how we've tried to re-examine and redesign our approach to the financing of mine action activities. You'll all be aware that there's a very clear link between security and development, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals place mine action very much at the heart of those efforts. Since the crisis kicked off in March and all of our contracts were initially affected, we conducted a fair amount of research to look at how we could protect the contracts we had, how we could plan to restart work, and how we could resume as quickly as possible. Through that work, we drew a number of conclusions. Firstly, that we recognise commercial contracts really no longer offered value for money to donors in the current environment. And secondly, that if we could somehow encourage national NGOs to take the lead in clearance, we could not only lessen the impact of COVID on the delivery of those operations, but we can also increase the benefit for donors. We took a far more intelligent approach to looking at those teams, and we focused very much on facilitating development of capability rather than actually trying to provide it for you or for the Iraqi government. So through this work, just very quick summary, we've sought very much to exploit the COVID crisis. We've tried to be proactive, pragmatic, and cost-effective in developing a sustainable solution to the need for mine action as an enabler of security and socio-economic development. And we'd very much like to, through the questions, share some of those lessons with you. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. My name is Elizabeth Mutunga. I'm the head of governance, peace, and security in COMESA. I know that many people know about COMESA mostly as it is a body that deals with economic integration. And that is, we are really well known for that. We have got the largest free trade area in the continent, apart from the now the new continental free trade area. We have done many things right now within the COVID, and one of the things is that we adopted the guidelines to facilitate trade, being one of our biggest area of competence. And but apart from that, COMESA is also, we also have a program on peace and security that not many people know about, and that is a program that I head. We have programs in conflict prevention, conflict management, post-conflict reconstruction, as well as democracy and governance. And that is anchored in our treaty, where we look at peace and security as an enabler for economic development. I hope that is sufficient for now.
Thank you very much. Now we go straight to our questions. Distinguished panelists, I will be asking you one question each for the first round. Then we'll have a second round where I will have some follow-up questions. So Benjamin, get ready. My first question to you is, to what extent has the current global pandemic impacted on the African economies and the implications to new investment in the security sector? Please.
Mr. Chairman, from the African Development Bank perspective, we have always argued that development brings security and stability on the continent. So regarding COVID-19, the full extent of the impact is yet to be fully assessed by the multilateral development banks. But from where we sit as the African Development Bank, a quick assessment is that the continent's economies have been set back between 5 to 10 years. This is the immediate impact that we can say. Africa has a huge informal sector jobs. Now you have everything locked out for 9 months. People can't go to the markets. People can't sell anything. People can't leave their houses. So we are talking of a situation of COVID restrictions, lockdown, curfew, closure of ports of entry. So everything came to a standstill. So you can imagine what that means to an ordinary man in the urban areas or elsewhere. It's total disaster. The economy has, rather the impact has suffocated movement of fertilizers, agricultural input, the seeds, fuel that is largely imported into the continent. So you have now an agricultural season that is dead before we start. There's no inputs, there's no fertilizers for rural communities or for the farming communities to go back into the field. They've been totally suffocated. So the agribusiness, the downstream agribusiness, has also been dissipated by COVID-19. We have economies on the continent that rely on commodities such as mining, oil, and to a large extent, tourism. All has come to a complete standstill. I'll give you an example. In 2016, the tourism sector, it attracted 62.9 million tourists, international tourists, onto the continent. Now you close that out for as long as we have done. The income in 2016 was $36.2 billion. So you can do your maths and assess how much the continent has lost from the tourism sector. Look at the jobs in the airline industry. If you ground all the airlines for as long as we have done, you can imagine the impact to that industry, to the jobs to that industry. Everything has come to a standstill. They have the other ongoing costs where they park the aircrafts, where they are grounded, they still have to pay. Where is the money going to come from? Yet we all know that the margins in the airline industries are very, very, very small. So basically, we are saying governments on the continent, their income streams have been killed in a very short period of time. There will be no foreign investment. It's going to be lowered because every country has been affected. So the level of foreign direct investment is going to be lowered. In terms of commodities, I want to go back to the issue of oil. There are countries on the continent whose 95% of their income depends on oil exports to China. There has been no movement. So the projections from the African Development Bank is that such countries are going to export only 6% of their oil. So this is the extent, in a nutshell, of the impact of COVID-19 on the continent from the African Development Bank perspective. Mr. Chairman, I thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Benjamin. Now I go to Ms. Elizabeth Mutunga from COMESA. Elizabeth, my first question to you is highlight some of the main factors from the impact of COVID-19 on the economy that could lead to the exacerbating the security situation. Please.
Okay, even as I begin to highlight some of the factors, let me maybe give you a little bit of a little background perhaps. And what I would say is that when you look at COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, it affected our region, the COMESA region, basically the continent in very, very many ways. But the expectation for our region, for the expectation for Africa, was that the disease itself was really going to devastate our region. It was really, really going to devastate Africa, because you know that the health situation in our region is very much inferior to what is happening in the rest, in the developed world. But then at the end of September, as we are coming to the end of September, we have very different statistics, because you'll notice that, okay, for example, COMESA has got 21 member states, and that is about 10% of the countries that were affected by COVID-19. COMESA's region has 1.07% of the caseload of COVID-19. And you can say that our region does not have a lot of testing, and therefore maybe the caseload is should have been actually higher. But then again, if you look at the fatality relating to COVID-19, you find that COMESA region accounts to 1.55% of all the fatality, the COVID-related fatality. The point I'm trying to make here is that COVID-19 in itself has not had such a huge impact in our region. And as the former panelists said, the issue is really relating to the measures that have been put in place. And if you look at the COMESA region, for example, in 2019, just before COVID, the growth rate in COMESA was 3.3%, that is on average, with some countries way above the 5%. And Rwanda had a growth rate of 9%, over 9%, Kenya 5.7%, Egypt 5.6%. But the projected growth in now, as we look at COVID, it's projected to be between minus 3.3%, and at the worst, it could even be minus 5%. So that is just as a background. But now to talk about the argument, the factors that I think would really affect the issue of insecurity, I would say that poverty in itself generally is not usually a factor to conflict. But the biggest factor is usually issues related to inequality. Now, if you look at COVID has affected the countries it has actually propagated some of these inequalities, and these are the inequalities that I want to talk about that could propagate conflicts or could propagate insecurity. I'm going to look at two main factors and then also look at the youth factor. Let me look at, first of all, the issue of SMEs versus, not SMEs, but micro, small, and medium enterprises, that is MSMEs, versus the large size or the larger size businesses or larger size enterprises. And studies have shown that there is a much larger decline among the SMEs than the larger businesses. And of course, that is expected because in the larger businesses, you have kind of, the businesses could be semi-automated, but with SMEs, you're dealing with very, what can I say, with very, the method of operating is mostly very, very manual, and therefore they were among those that suffered mostly from COVID. When you look at the SMEs, studies show that over 90% of Africa's businesses are SMEs. And those SMEs account to between 60 and 70% of the employment in the region in Africa. So you're looking at a sector that is very, very crucial to growth and to development. And as I've mentioned, the workplace closures have been bigger than those of the other manufacturing industries, which are more automated. And apart from the automation, also the access to inputs, and the former panelist already talked about that, is also a very, very big factor. Then also the availability of markets. You know, the consumers are now deferring their spending, and especially to what they consider as non-essential products or commodities. So the important point I'd like to say, and in many ways my focus is on unemployment, is that we will find that a large sector of the SMEs are closed down or operating at very, very, very low levels. And when you talk about this, the issue now becomes that you're having an inequality in a certain sector, which will still need to survive. And this sector will therefore may have to start, people that work for this sector will probably look for other means of livelihood. They could be used in terrorism and other such like activities. So that is one area, the divide between the COVID, the SMEs and the larger businesses. But the second, and I think more important inequality that I would wish to address is the issue related to education. This may not appear to have a very direct or close impact relating to COVID. But one of the things that I can say is that we can never overstate the value of education with regard to improving the social economic status of individuals. And in that, I look at the inequality in two ways. I look at the global inequality, that is Africa against the developed world, and also inequalities within the country. Now, one thing is that if you look at the global front, UNESCO has shown that 50% of the students globally after COVID did not have access to computers, and if you look at Africa, the figure becomes almost 90%. One did not have access to computers in their homes. Then you also look at internet. Again, the same studies show that over 40% students did not have access to internet globally. And then if you look at our continent, it's over 80%. What am I saying? And that is not even to mention other things such as the connectivity. And even right now in our meeting, we can see the connectivity issues already are coming up. And what I'm saying is that Africa and our region is highly disadvantaged. And why is that a problem? That is a problem because you will find that it will create some grievances. Our country, our region, or not just even Africa, but the less developed countries, the third world countries, there will be some grievances that will even continue to rise up. And again, I think I've mentioned this before. This will now allow terror groups to find more recruits within our countries. So that is one of the linkages. But the second one, the second level of inequality is the one that I really want to focus on, and that is within the countries. There is number one, the rural and urban divide. In Africa, in COMESA, you find that most of the internet connectivity as well as ICT infrastructure is concentrated or skewed towards the urban centers as opposed to the rural centers. And when I say that, you know that the population in COMESA, we find that 60.8% is in the rural area, but it has been increasingly moving towards the urban centers. Now, if you have a situation like this where you're finding that the rural areas are going to be so much less advantaged regarding education, you can start to see that the migration is even going to get bigger. With a bigger migration to the urban areas will mean that we are talking about higher levels of crime. And then also the other divide, which is very important with relation to this, is the rich and poor divide. The richer families, of course, can afford internet. The richer families can afford computers in the house, which is not the case when you come to the poorer households, where you probably find, first of all, the number of school-going children in the poorer households is greater, and they will be forced to share probably one computer. So you find that the strain is a lot higher between the richer and the poorer. And again, I don't have to stress what happens when you have inequalities, bigger inequalities between the poor and the rich, and that is where again we start to see the crime rising. And the third inequality that I would want to touch on is the issue of gender inequality. There is some very alarming statistics that have shown that the rise in teenage pregnancies really shot up during the COVID pandemic shutdown. And this comes at the backdrop of a time when we have been saying that our region has really been improving on its gender mainstreaming. We have been seeing a lot women much more mainstreamed, even in decision-making in schools and so on and so forth. I believe, and we're waiting for the final statistics in this, but I believe that going forward, we are going to see a lot of school dropouts among the girls. And this is going to bring another inequality which does not support inclusive growth and does not therefore support security. I think I've spoken for too long, but I also wanted to touch on the youth. I don't know if you'll allow me, Chair. Maybe let me do so because this is a pre-recorded. You can cut it off if it is too long. So I'll go on with the youth issue. The role of youth in conflict cannot be overstated, and they have played a very big role both in the escalation of conflict as well as in peace building or peacekeeping. Not peacekeeping, but peace building. Yes, and we need, and as much as possible, we have been moving towards moving the youth to work more in peace building than in conflict prevention and management. Sorry, more than in the escalation of conflict. Now, if you look at the current youth employment in COMESA, it's about the COMESA's population, youth population is about 60%, and yet No, sorry, about 39%, and yet the dependency of youth on the population is about 60%. Now, if you look at what is happening right now, I've talked about education. Education is going to affect the youth a lot more than it will affect the other age groups, the other demographics. The other issue is the issue of SMEs. You know, many of the youth work in manual labor, which could not continue to be done virtually like most of the others. And then also there's a health concern. And with the health concern, you're looking at youth who are now being faced with health issues, depression, and feelings of hopelessness. And those are the things that will let people will cause the youth to now go and take arms. And so, Chair, let me stop here now, but I'll be very happy to take any follow-up questions on those issues that I have raised. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question to our third panelist, Dr. Mark. This is, what are the intended outcomes of the grants and what advantages do they offer donors in the long term? Can I repeat? What are the intended outcomes of the grants and what advantages do they offer donors in the longer term? Dr. Mark, please.
Thank you very much. Just before I get into the detail of that, I just think it's interesting to tie in the answer to this question to some of the comments we've heard from my colleagues on the panel. Firstly, the comments Benjamin made about the impact of COVID on trade across African nations, which is obviously incredibly significant and likely to have very long-term consequence. But also, Elizabeth, and the comments you made about the relationship between COVID, socioeconomic impact, and security. And I think it's here that perhaps I can answer this question, albeit from an Iraq perspective, but perhaps in a way that tries to show some similarities and commonalities in what we've been trying to deal with in Iraq. Iraq, like many countries around the world, particularly countries in Africa, has been severely impacted by COVID-19. And I think we probably haven't yet reached a peak of that impact. COVID-19 has directly challenged both the management of our funding to deliver humanitarian mine action activities, as well as perhaps more worryingly, what the future funding or financing position for clearance operations is. And again, to link to what I've just commented on, that Benjamin and Elizabeth's point, if you recognise that humanitarian mine action is an enabler to both security and socioeconomic development, then I think what we've done in Iraq has some very, very interesting comparisons to the African context. So to focus on the question itself that you asked, as I've already mentioned, UNMAS Iraq has tried to use the COVID crisis as an opportunity rather than a threat. And by doing that, we've tried to both re-examine and redesign our approach to the financing of humanitarian mine action activities, but also to try and innovate in their delivery, mindful of those issues that I've just identified and discussed with you. We've been very active within UNMAS Iraq, certainly over the last 18 months, in trying to conduct really deep and meaningful research about the impact of our humanitarian mine action programs, and also how we can more effectively, more efficiently manage those to make better use of donor money and obviously maximize the impact on the population of Iraq, who ultimately we're here to try and clear those explosive hazards for. So through a process of lessons learned, much of the work conducted through the stand down period that was forced upon us through COVID, we've looked at developing new solutions to better deliver the clearance of humanitarian mine action activities. Some interesting points, and again, hopefully there'll be parallels to some context within Africa. Our evidence and research very much showed that commercial contracts, which really was the favoured way to try to generate mine action activity in Iraq, really could no longer be seen to offer any kind of value for money to donors. And that's applicable both within the physical explosive hazard clearance environments, as well as the security landscape, which we found ourselves in, and having a really quite profound impact, likely for some of those very good reasons that Elizabeth's already mentioned. Next, we started to look at, if we removed the commercial profit-making element of humanitarian mine action, what could we actually replace that with? So we started to engage very, very much with national non-government organisations, and we started to explore what we would need to do as UNMAS to facilitate them as organisations to become humanitarian mine action actors. And clearly the logic underpinning that work was that if we could get national NGOs to take on responsibility for that work, they would likely represent the best possible and most financially viable outcomes for donors, and particularly given the likely continuing impact of COVID on the global economy. We also recognised that we needed to be far more intelligent in how we were designing requirements for humanitarian mine action activities. And we've started to focus much more on specifying what the end state should look like, rather than what the physical delivery should be made up of, should be comprised of, what equipment it should have, and so on. And through all of that, we started to think about how we could facilitate the development of clearance capability, as opposed to dictating or mandating the physical delivery of those activities. So acknowledging the difficulties inherent in resolving those points through commercial profit-making contracts, we started to develop a grant-funded mechanism through which ultimately we could transfer the ownership of not only the explosive hazard clearance problem, but also the ability to address it directly to the government of Iraq through the empowerment of national non-government organisations. The UNMAS grants themselves were designed to have a number of outcomes, but effectively they focused around really the exam question for us. How can we do humanitarian mine action clearance smarter, cheaper and better? And that very much drove our research. We did a number of things. We facilitated the establishment of formal and long-term commitments between international and national NGOs operating within Iraq. And through that partnership, we looked for an absolute commitment to the development of skills, knowledge and attributes across a 2-year period that UNMAS would actually fund those activities through. The end state would be a national NGO that was an independent clearance actor at the end of it. The development of national NGOs centred around a number of specific capacities that we in UNMAS Iraq believed were absolutely integral to an effective humanitarian mine action activity. And we wrote the grant proposals in such a way that those capacities were considered as an integral part of a coherent humanitarian mine action organisation. We specified the absolute importance of fully nationalised explosive hazard clearance teams that were fully aligned with both national and international standards. And whilst we obviously wanted to deliver physical clearance of physical delivery of humanitarian mine action activities very early on, what we actually did was put a primary aim on the development of capacity, with the actual physical delivery taking second place. What that did was allowed us also to exploit the gap in our ability to deliver clearance activity caused by COVID, caused by stand down, caused by the changing security situation, so that we could meaningfully allocate funds to these development activities, so that when the conditions were right, when the restrictions were lifted, we'd done the bulk of that work to physically get teams out on the ground clearing explosive hazards. Ultimately, we were interested in the creation of a fully sustainable and an inclusive Iraqi national clearance capability. Just to very quickly sum up, if I could make a couple of points. For the donor, we believe the grant mechanism offers a viable endpoint for the provision of funds. And I think that's really, really important, particularly if you consider what's likely to happen with the appetite for donor funding for humanitarian mine action activities going forwards. Instead of asking donors to really purchase a 12-month clearance team or a clearance team for a 12-month period. We're actually now asking for funds to establish a self-sustaining and independent entity. Just to finish off the figures, what have we actually achieved here? The first grant for UNMAS Iraq was signed in mid-September of this year, and we're hopeful that 3 more will follow in October. The like-for-like costs of a 12-month duration mine action clearance contract, as opposed to a 12-month like-for-like grant-delivered capability, has seen immediately a 66% reduction in cost of delivery alone. That means we've taken the cost of 12 months of mine action delivery from approximately $6 million down to actually under $2 million. The longer term savings, I think, are likely to be even more significant. But to bring back to where I started, if we consider within the context that's been discussed here of Africa, of significant impact on national economies, the relationship between COVID, the security development nexus, I think that what we've done with grants in Iraq potentially offers a very, very interesting opportunity for broader use across the African continent to try to develop the same kind of national ownership of those problems in the longer term. Mr. Chair, I hope that's answered the question. I'll pass back to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Distinguished panelists, now we are in the second round of our questions. These will be follow-up questions from the earlier questions which I asked you. In the same sequence, I will start with Benjamin Chidyamoto from the ADB. Benjamin, my second question to you is, how will this affect the key international leaders' priorities, and how can security leaders innovate to do more with less?
So we painted a picture of the impact of COVID-19, how the economies have been destroyed. And Elizabeth has picked a very important point, that the actual deaths from COVID are minimum on the continent. What is horrendous is the economic impact. In my assessment is that the concern that we are dealing with, where the security sector now needs to be focusing on and to really be ready to work very hard, is the fallout, the economic fallout. Elizabeth has already touched on the youth unemployment. And I've stated that much of our economies in Africa are informal, and those jobs have gone. And this is going to trigger a lot of violence, crimes of violence on the continent. And we cannot fold our arms. The youth are now vulnerable to recruitment by terrorists on the basis of bright economic prospects. And governments themselves are going to be so weak because institutions have been weakened or will be weakened by poor resources or lack of funding. So when you have a weak and high unemployment, a weak institutions, the countries are likely to be unmanageable, ungovernable. So the security sector needs to work together, pool their resources, fight crime as regions, as groupings on the continent, fight terrorism as regions, as opposed to individual countries, because the resources are no longer there. So if crime and terrorism are not effectively suppressed, the recovery, post-COVID recovery, will take longer. Why? The flow of tourists is going to dry. Not for the fear of COVID, or not that they've been incapacitated by COVID, but no one wants to go and die. So the security sector now needs to work together to do more with less in terms of managing adverse fallout of COVID. Take, for example, the Zimbabwe experience. Without any resources, without major resources for a long period of time, the police have resorted to using cost-effective means of transport in urban areas, bicycling, cycling. So you see a lot of policemen on bicycles these days, as opposed to flashy cars, which are expensive to run. The government doesn't have the capacity to buy as many vehicles as they would want. So I see many countries now on the continent capacitating their police officers, encouraging them to use bicycles. That's much cheaper, way cheaper. And post-COVID should be triggering such innovations that you be effective using the cheapest means of policing. The security sector needs to be fully integrated with the economic sectors for them to understand the impact of their efforts to economic growth. I've touched on tourism. If the security sector and the economic sectors work together, the flash points will be identified and areas of cross-cutting will be identified, and therefore the little resources available will be effectively deployed to manage the situation. Now, as the African Development Bank, what are we going to do to assist countries post-COVID financing? Countries, member countries, have heavily borrowed from us, and now they can't pay. So what is our immediate response? Our immediate response is budget support. Because you have somebody that owes you money and they are now in intensive care, you don't want them to die. Because if they die, they will never pay. Or if they will be able to, if they survive, it will take them many, many years to pay you. So we are going to give them lifelines in debt management. So we manage them how to get out of the situation, how to resuscitate the economies so they can become more productive again, create more jobs, collect more revenue from their citizens who are now gainfully employed, and be able to pay the loans. So budget support is what we are going to be looking at. Debt sustainability is key to keeping the governments alive and to retain the fewer jobs that are available. So you retain them, you capacitate them, you give them the means of being productive again. We look at the agricultural sector, for example. Countries import, some countries in Africa import as much as 75% of their food requirements. They can produce it on the continent. They cannot produce it in their own countries. So if you abandon such a country, it means you are sending those people, you are throwing those people under the bus, and we don't want to do that. So we will provide countries with the means of survival, with the means to be able to import, to continue to import food. And therefore, when there's constant flow of food, the chances of strife, national strife, that can lead to a major security fallout are minimized. So this is where we are coming from as the African Development Bank. And our response, therefore, is Feed Africa post-COVID situation. We want the countries to be able to feed themselves. First, by providing the means for import. Two, by supporting the agriculture and agribusiness sectors to start again. So African countries should now be able to produce food post-COVID, and the agro-business will then process that food and distribute it among their populations. And the inter-African trade will then become more vibrant. And when you have a vibrant inter-African trade and intra-trade, internal trade within the countries, you are creating jobs. And jobs, in our view, create stability. Jobs, employment, and prospects for the youth means that youth move away from crime to be productive, because there's hope for them to prosper in their own countries. We don't want to see them cross the Mediterranean going to Europe. We want to keep them in Africa, because the potential that we have in Africa is huge because of the large youth population that we have, and because of the resources that we still have in Africa. We want the youth to remain on the continent, to be productive, and to recover from the setback that has been triggered by COVID-19. So in summary, Mr. Chairman, what I'm saying is that the security sector should be aware that there are serious security threats that can emanate from collapsed governance and collapsed economies. And therefore, they need to be encouraged to do more with less. The countries don't have the money to reinvest in the security sector, but the security sectors can work together internally in the countries, in the region, to pool their resources and manage the consequences of the post-COVID. They need to manage crime situations, terrorist situation, so that the tourism industry that will use the existing infrastructure will start again without any threat. They don't need to create a post-COVID economic negation comes from crime and insecurity. The sense of security for the visiting tourist needs to be enhanced, and enhanced by managing effective management of the threats that we already know, by using the minimum resources that will be available. And that way, the economies are likely to recover, and the threat of collapse of government will be manageable. I thank you.
I have a follow-up question, another follow-up question from myself to you, Benjamin. This is, don't you think that COVID-19 pandemic is a wake-up call for your organization to consider proposing mitigation measures in times of natural calamities for African countries? If so, what is the AfDB think about it?
COVID-19 was not only a wake-up call for the AfDB, but it's a wake-up call for the entire world. So what should we do now? We are going to invest heavily in the health infrastructure, research and development, so that the countries can be more resilient and develop robust medical responses to future pandemics. We are going to fund heavily the process of development of an effective and cheaper vaccine that will be accessible by all nations on our continent. Without an effective vaccine, the cloud of a second or third wave of COVID-19 will remain, and that will deter potential investors. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I go to Elizabeth. My second question, Elizabeth, to you is, where should we exert most effort to minimize the negative impacts of the economic downturn on the increase in crime and on the peace and the security dynamics. I hope it's clear.
Thank you very, very much, Chair. And I was actually very happy to hear the response that Benjamin gave, his full response, and even especially the response he gave on your follow-up question when he talked about ADB really looking to enhance resilience, long-term resilience, because that's exactly what my answer is all about. My answer is in my answer, I'm going to mix the idea of long-term resilience with also addressing the COVID-related impact. And for that, I'm guided by quantitative analysis. And Habib, as you may know, that COMESA has developed a very robust conflict early warning system, which is called COM1. And it is based on data-driven and theory-informed model that provides structural vulnerabilities assessments. Now, unlike most other early warning systems, the COMESA system does not anticipate emergence of conflict, but rather our model provides structural drivers to likely impact on vulnerability and resilience of member states. It is anchored on what we call the COMESA Peace and Prosperity Index. Now, I do not want to go into the discussions or describe the model to you, but for this particular panel, what I could say is to assure you that the model has already been tested for accuracy and reliability. So whatever it is that I tell you now is based on data or a model that has been tested very well. Now, the last run that we did on COM1, just before COVID-19, it was done in 2019, gave us some very interesting and important drivers that will be a big contributing factor in the COMESA region for long-term vulnerability and resilience in most of our member states. But just to caution that what I'm going to talk about, or these structural drivers do not impact on peace and security dynamics individually, but they kind of work together. They work together on the impact on the peace and conflict dynamics. And but for the purpose of this meeting, I'm going to isolate them. I'm going to talk about them individually, but then please bear in mind that you're talking about factors that interact with each other. And what came out from the model was that the issue of infrastructure development is one of the key drivers of resilience in the COMESA region. And in fact, 16 out of the 21 member states of COMESA have identified, or at least the data has identified, infrastructure development as one of the key factors of resilience. The other one is higher education, and 13 countries have identified higher education as one of the key drivers, the key structural drivers towards resilience in our region, or rather in the countries. And another one is health-related drivers. And the fourth one is technological readiness, where 12 countries have identified technological readiness as one of the key drivers to resilience in their countries or in the region. Now, having said that, the proposal, therefore, I would give, or recommendations that I would give for reducing the impact of COVID, and more importantly, enhancing the long-term resilience in our region, would be number one. Most countries should, we expect that most countries right now are choosing emergency-related issues to deal with. They are choosing recurrent related expenses to deal with. But the recommendation would be a bigger focus should be given on infrastructure development in all countries, and that would make a huge difference to enhancing the overall resilience in our countries. And certainly it would make a difference also in the short term, because if you're talking about infrastructure development, you're now talking about some of the issues that we've talked about earlier on, and that is the issue of employment, youth employment. So that is the first. The second I would talk about is the need to really enhance technological advancement, and that's a big one for our region, and we cannot afford to ignore this one. And the need should focus on technological development, not access to IT, as well as increased connectivity in the region, or rather in the different countries. But very importantly, to go along with what I had said earlier on, it should be done not just for the urban centers, but it should be done equally in across the countries. Then the third thing is education, which is already affected by the technological readiness that I'm talking about. And so I will not really emphasize on that, only to say that when you're talking about enhancing education as a measure or as a means of enhancing long-term resilience, then you should also focus not just on the students, but also focus on the teachers as well. There's need to strengthen the teachers or the teaching staff, especially on the use of technology. In our region, by the way, one of the factors that has led to low education during this COVID is that the teachers themselves do not seem to be very well versed with the technology or even have access to the technology. And even the curricula developed has not been developed to take into account virtual learning. And then the fourth and the last one is the issue of health improvement, which Benjamin has talked about quite a lot. And so I won't really get into this, but what I would say is that the issue of improving the health sector is a very low-hanging fruit at the moment. Why am I saying it's a low-hanging fruit at the moment? It has become very clear to the rest of the world that if one country is weak, then it will affect the whole globe. If there's a contagious disease in one country, no matter how small it is, we just saw it with COVID. So there should be a very huge appetite right now for the donors. AfDB has even said that themselves, to now really focus on strengthening the health sector in our region. Now, as I talk, please remember that what I'm talking about is something that has come out from our model, and it came before COVID, that shows that if you just improve the health sector, you'll be improving the longer term resilience in our region. So now it is not only addressing the COVID issue, but it is also addressing the longer term resilience. So there's really need to pump a lot of money into the health sector. And so I think that is all, but before I conclude, let me just have a mention something about SMEs, MSMEs, and also because I talked about it quite a bit, but also Benjamin has actually talked about what I would have wanted to say, that there is also need to really revitalize this sector, the small, medium, micro, small, and medium enterprises. We need to really revitalize this sector. But even as I said that, I want to end with just highlighting some of the good efforts that our region has made within this sector. For example, you find that countries like Eswatini and Rwanda have given tax refunds to SMEs. You find Egypt has developed a corona tax, and that is, whatever comes out of that tax goes into the SMEs. Uganda has delayed or at least deferred the tax payments by MSMEs. And Kenya is one of the countries that have developed stimulus packages for SMEs. So even as we talk, our region has actually been trying very hard to also address some of these issues. So that, I think, would conclude my answer to that question.
Thank you, thank you. Now, Dr. Mark Wilkinson, my second my second question to you, which is a follow-up question anyway, is in simple terms, what does the grant methodology achieve?
Okay, I can probably answer that fairly quickly, actually, and really just link back to what was actually quite a careful and logical analysis of the changing humanitarian mine action environment in Iraq set against the impact of COVID-19. And in simple terms, the grant methodology actually achieves four things. Firstly, it makes an intelligent acknowledgement of the changing dynamics of mine action clearance requirements, but set against the backdrop of COVID. In addition, we acknowledge the impact that COVID's had on the security environment, and we also acknowledge that there will be likely significant reductions in donor funding. The grant methodology acknowledges all of those and intelligently influences the clearance solutions that we design off the back of that. Secondly, the National Authority for Mine Action in Iraq gives a sanctioned, coherent and integrated approach to the capacity development of a national humanitarian mine action NGO. And I think that's really, really important and really, really significant. This is about national ownership in a non-profit way to a non-government organisation in Iraq that can work into the future on its own accord. Thirdly, we have achieved a risk-reduced and a resilient approach to continuing clearance-related activities while subject to COVID-19 restrictions. And again, that's helped us very much to use COVID as much as we can as an opportunity to start to work smarter, cheaper and better in delivering the services that we're trying to provide. And finally, the final point that the grant methodology achieves is that we believe it gives a really viable pathway towards creating a full Iraqi national clearance capability. And significantly, we believe that is cost effective, it's flexible, and it's credible as a long-term solution to the challenge of explosive hazard contamination in Iraq. And that long-term solution, we believe, is as important to the people of Iraq, the government of Iraq, as it is to the donors that we will continue to approach to support the work that we're delivering. That's it from me. I'll pass back to you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you very much, my panelists. All of you, you have responded very well to the questions. I thank you once again for sharing your experiences, and your valuable contribution will be remembered always. I would also take this opportunity to thank the organizers, GRV Global, for giving us this opportunity, especially for this session during this particular period of COVID-19. We have to think outside the box on how our African economies is going to survive during this period of time. As we are all aware, no country is spared of this pandemic. So we need to come together and think on how we are going to manage the situation and helping our people. Having said that, I would like to once again thank my able panelists, Benjamin Chidyamoto, Elizabeth Mutunga, and Dr. Mark Wilkinson. Thank you very much. I hope we have an opportunity to meet again. Thank you. Thank you.